Welcome to another edition of Geopolitics and Empire. Quick reminder, support the transmission. Your support is crucial for me to continue on these airwaves. The best way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber on the Substack, a little over $9 a month or a little over $90 a year. You can also become a founding member or put whatever amount you'd like. And I do private weekly chats with paid subscribers only. I do a weekly news roundup and commentary for paid subscribers only. And sometimes we're bringing back past podcast guests to do a live Q&A with paid subscribers. You can also donate through Buy Me a Coffee, Donor Box, Wise, and other methods. And if you'd like to chat with me about expatriation, geopolitics, conspiracies, podcasting, or the meaning of life, you can purchase a consult. And our sponsor this month is Mikkel Thorup's Expat Money Summit, taking place October 7th to the 11th online for free. You can catch the free 24-hour stream. After that, you'll have to get the VIP upgrade. And if you decide to do that, use the promo Empire, and you'll get $100 off. I'll be participating in one of the VIP panels to talk World War III. And again, most of the headline speakers have been guests in Geopolitics and Empire, Dr. Ron Paul, Scott Horton, Doug Casey, and others. And the summit is all about internationalization, getting multiple residencies, passports, preparing for the Great Reset, looking at foreign real estate, finding sort of your tribe or community and that sort of stuff. Check out my affiliates as well and leave a podcast review if you have not already. Joining us is lecturer in international relations, Dr. Tara McCormack from the University of Leicester. Welcome to Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you so much for inviting me on.
So I've been following your work for a few years. I follow your tweeting and commentary on X. I don't think we found a verb yet to replace tweeting, but and so I very much appreciate the work you're doing, your analysis. And if you could just to start, tell us a bit about the work you're doing, your main research focuses.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, I guess when I started doing my academic work, I was looking at questions around humanitarian intervention. And particularly at the time, that was on the former Yugoslavia, humanitarian intervention, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and the wars were framed in a very specific way in the West. The New Wars thesis is kind of ultra-barbaric, non-political conflicts, essentially. And the only answer was that the international community should intervene and had a right and a duty to intervene. And of course, it's a lot more complicated. And actually, when you really look into it, you can see that international intervention was a key part of the breakup and wars from the very start, really looking at from the end of the 80s onwards. So I guess that's where I started looking at questions around humanitarian intervention, and then also thinking about how sovereignty was being reframed as part of that from the, I guess, UN Charter idea of sovereignty as non-intervention and equality to humanitarian intervention. Then sovereignty was particularly addressed in the responsibility to protect idea, which argues essentially that when a state is committing human rights abuses, say, for example, then it is essentially not sovereign. And therefore, the international community is really, when it intervenes, it has a right and a duty to intervene. But effectively, the international community isn't breaching sovereignty, it's giving back sovereignty, as it were. Now, of course, evacuated from that discussion are questions, very straightforward questions of power. You know, who's making those decisions about which states need a bit of social contract restoring bombing? You know, it's obviously not going to be the smaller states. So that was really how my interests emerged around in that period in the 90s, particularly around Kosovo. And then, of course, in the noughties, moving into Iraq, Afghanistan. So that's it. So my interests have always been around sovereignty, looking at power within international relations, and current, and then moving also into questions around democracy at home as well, within the UK, thinking about how our foreign policy is conducted, and what are the implications at home for democracy?
Yeah, I think I'm pretty sure at some point I've written a paper on R2P, responsibility to protect, and we can get further into that.
It's a good one, yeah.
I mean, it's. I just feel it's mostly a sham for we can get into foreign policy and regime change operations. But you mentioned the basically power, and I always like to start big picture on my podcast. I think listeners know, and they like that. I'd like to look at things as big picture as possible, and then we can drill on down. And where does this come from? Where did this start? I think we're in the age of empires. Guy Verhofstadt, I'm no fan of his, but a few years ago, he gave a speech where he said we're in the age of empires. The Russian Empire. And I think that's the first and only time I've ever agreed with him. You've got the Russian Empire, Chinese Empire, Indian Empire. The EU is an empire, as Wolfgang Streeck has pointed out, the American Empire, so on and so forth. And so we've got this transnational elite, and I think it's one of the first times in history where they truly have a transnational grip on power. And I've seen in some of your interviews, you've talked about how the line is blurred between the state and these transnational interests and corporations, bankers, foundations, trilateral commissions, World Economic Forums, Bilderberg meetings. What's sort of your view on this?
So I think I think America is still the hegemonic power. I do think there has been something quite interesting that has gone on with the end of the Cold War, where there has been a shift to, particularly with the war on terror, there has been a massive military expansion and a shift to more direct control. Whereas post-World War II, you had, there's lots of different ways of describing it, informal empire, economic empire, particularly in Europe, for example, and in other areas of the world, the political elites were ruled by America by agreement. It was consensual hegemony, I guess. Post-war in Europe, the America basically rescues European capitalists from their own people. Says, we'll help you. You just got to rearrange your economy and, transform the unions and so on, but we'll help you. And then, of course, in other areas of the world, Latin America, more direct control via proxies and so on. But I think one of the interesting things that's happened since the end of the Cold War, and particularly with the war on terror, is that there has been a kind of expansion of American direct military control, American military bases. And I think this is to do with shifting global power. I think this is to do with the rise ultimately of China, the BRICS countries. Now, I wouldn't really see these countries yet as alternative empires, but I would certainly say we are entering, not to jump ahead, into a more multipolar world. And I think Syria was quite a watershed in that respect, actually, when Assad goes to Russia and says, and Iran, will you help me fight against many of the Western-funded jihadi groups? And Russia says, yep, of course. But also prior to that, Libya, I think, also is quite significant. There's a good quote from Robert Gates, the former Defence Secretary, in one of John Mearsheimer's articles, where Gates is saying, because Libya was framed as a responsibility to protect limited humanitarian intervention, but in fact, as we know, as has been reported even on the BBC, we sent special forces in, for example, to help jihadi groups to topple Gaddafi, because Britain essentially wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. And there's a good quote from Robert Gates where he says, the Russians thought they'd been taken for suckers, that they'd agreed. And they had agreed to this supposedly limited humanitarian intervention. Well, Russia and China had basically abstained in the UN Security Council a vote, which is how you say okay without losing face. It's like, okay, we'll let it. So Libya is quite, I think, Libya is quite important in that respect as well. So I do think we're seeing a shift to put it very, very shorthand, for what's obviously a very complicated discussion, a more multipolar order. But at the moment, I do still think America is the hegemon on the block. Now, what happens, in the next 20 years is anyone's guess, whether that is an agreed transition, a peaceful transition, or war.
There's so many things I want to ask you here. You brought up Libya. When I was teaching international relations, I would use the book Destroying Libya and World Order by Dr. Francis Boyle, who later on I ended up doing a series of, he's been on the podcast a number of times. And in fact, my 2020 interview with Dr. Boyle on the COVID question was the biggest ever, hundreds of thousands of views, which led to a whole bunch of other stuff. And he pointed out in the book what you're alluding to, that Russia and China basically abstained. They let it happen because they were too weak at that moment to do anything. They had to throw Gaddafi basically to the dogs, to the UN and NATO. But now, a decade later, things have changed. Russia and China have become stronger. I do want to ask you, because you work in academia, and I used to teach as well. And in the Western world in particular, there's trouble sometimes for academics when it comes to teaching. I've interviewed the Swiss historian Daniele Ganser, who was run out of academia, but he's much more, he's wildly successful now. So good for him.
Who's written about his research on Operation Gladio?
Yeah. From what I understand, he was run out of academia in Switzerland, but now he's got his own foundation. He sells out every talk that he gives, and so I think that's much better in his case than staying in academia. I've met when I was in Switzerland, I had coffee with Aymeric Chaprade, this French geopolitician who was banned in all of France and Switzerland from teaching just because he went against the grain. He later entered politics. But even in Mexico, I had my courses taken away for a semester or two. And when you talk about some of the stuff like that you and I are talking about, when you question the narrative on the Syrian war and whatnot, your fellow teachers, the administration at the school kind of look at you like you're crazy. And I know it's there's nuance in some workplaces. They just kind of let you keep on. But what are your thoughts universally sort of in the academia space when you try to go against official narratives?
I suppose it definitely can be controversial. I mean, in terms of my arguments on humanitarian intervention and the R2P, those have just been the arguments I've always made, and I've never got into trouble with that. They aren't particularly popular arguments. We know, particularly as we know in academia, in the 90s, there's a real shift towards supporting humanitarian intervention and, seen as progressive and positive. So they're not particularly, they're not very, they're all minority positions. People who think that academia is full of hippie peaceniks who are against war, would be quite surprised to see how that's really not the case often. So I've certainly had, discussions with colleagues about supporting NATO and being against NATO intervention. I did recently, I was denounced in the House of Commons a couple of years ago when the war in Russia started because of things that I was tweeting. And that was quite an interesting discussion. My university did have a discussion with me, but we had a very actually useful discussion, whereas I said, are we saying now that we can only have opinions on foreign policy that the government supports? And actually the university was good and agreed that it was important to have to be able to have free speech around foreign policy, but
that was an interesting point you brought up, and I would agree with you that most of our peers in academia, even here in Mexico, I'd call them the liberal globalists. So pretty much all the people in the IR department where I used to teach, they would be for blow up Syria, blow up Iran, regime change, whoever,
Yeah, I think that's right. Liberal globalist is a good way of describing many people's approach in academia to international relations. Yeah, more intervention, how I learned to stop worrying and love NATO kind of always sort of comes to my mind. It's like, what happened? Yeah, so it can be problematic, but so far, and in 2018, of course, the Times denounced me and several colleagues on the front page. Obviously that was a priority on the day that Britain, France, and America bombed Damascus. The Times' priority was, of course, to denounce a handful of academics as Assad apologists. So
just 3 days ago, the Times was at it again. I believe that's the oldest British newspaper. Tim Hayward.
Oh yes.
Just 3 days ago, it says academic accused of spreading propaganda to run a censorship course. And I'm a fan of his. I've never spoken to him, but
absolutely.
You better be careful now, Tara. After this podcast, you might get the Times attack you. I'm not joking because
I know, again.
I've had a number of guests. I talked to Piers Robinson. I'm sure you're familiar with. I think it was 2020 or 2021.
Yeah. Well, Piers was part of that denunciation. Yeah.
And right after my interview with him, his appearance in Geopolitics and Empire, the Times did a hit piece on him using a screen grab of his appearance in Geopolitics and Empire, and call, the usual a bunk of conspiracy theorists, this and that, and so I think that proves that those are your credentials, Tara. Those are your street credentials.
Great.
And you mentioned when you're talking about the American Empire, and I'd agree with you. They are getting more forceful. You see them building bases around the world, and they're pushing for an Asian NATO. I'm just mind blown as an American citizen and as an EU Croatian citizen, just looking at NATO and how well the propaganda effort is, where it's so war is peace. I mean, we even had Stoltenberg a few months ago basically say weapons is he basically said war is peace. There was a quote where he talked about giving weapons to Ukraine is peace or something like that. So it's literally Orwellian. And I've been pointing out there have been white papers in these liberal globalist think tanks tied to NATO's brain, as I call it, Atlantic Council. They're talking about Mexico should join NATO. We've got Colombia and Argentina as partners. I mean, come on, that's basically like you're halfway in the door to becoming a NATO member. And then Stavridis, this retired general, a few months back said, "Look, let's cut the game, let's cut the foreplay. Just take Thailand and Singapore and all these countries and just make them official members of NATO. And then you've got Asian NATO." But you mentioned after World War II, the American Empire came in, Marshall Plan, all that stuff to transform the Union. That made me think of the European Union and how most people don't know that more than 50% of the EU project was financed by the CIA, the State Department, and it's basically an outpost of Washington, which is the current base for the globalist system. So, what do you make of the EU and NATO?
Well, so post World War II, essentially there were two tracks to American hegemony, and one was NATO in Europe. One was NATO, well, including Turkey, of course. That was the military aspect, and one was the EEC, or even the coal and steel community, which eventually becomes the EEC, the EU. And it's really interesting when you look at them. So, of course, after the Cold War, Soviet Union's gone, you break up with the Warsaw Pact, end of the Soviet Union, and so you have the, rapid expansion of NATO and EU, and it goes hand in hand. But actually, if you look back from the immediate post-war period, post-World War II period, so you see that actually EU expansion and NATO expansion do go together, but it's just very, very slow because, of course, you have the block of the block of the USSR and the Warsaw Pact. So you'd have the two tracks, the kind of European, what becomes the European Union, which is the political and social track, really, and NATO. So they've always worked together. So that's often not really discussed or kind of fully understood. But I do think, as I've said in a recent article, nonetheless, even despite that, you still did have, and that's for that's because the way the financial architecture was organised, and you did have some still room for manoeuvre. I mean, one thinks immediately of someone like de Gaulle, for example, or in Britain, although it has recently come out, the British website Declassified has written about this. Britain did support America's military adventure in Vietnam, but it couldn't do so publicly because there was strong because it was very unpopular domestically. But I mean, you can't imagine even that level of contestation now. You can't imagine any British politician from any party refusing to give wholehearted support to the latest kind of American military intervention. So to go back to the NATO expansion point, I mean, it just seems extraordinary. The idea that we should be expanding NATO, say to South America, to Asia, it seems extraordinary. But the reason we can have this almost like inevitable kind of train chugging on is partly to do, or quite a bit to do, with the way that the media works, for example, in the UK, in that you cannot have just the most basic realistic discussion. I mean, as in, why on earth would we want to do that? What would be, you can't even have a sort of discussion within very standard, almost liberal democratic parameters. Where would be our interests in doing that? How would our national interests be answered in terms of allowing Taiwan to join NATO? So there's a complete refusal, or rather say the media works so well in the UK, although then I'll speak to colleagues from other countries who will say, oh, it's even worse in so-and-so. But, the media works so well, so you don't have these kind of just very straightforward discussions are not had. And the only discussion is almost something from a kind of, 1950s Cold War poster, it's freedom or tyranny. We must even, Finland must join NATO because it's freedom or tyranny. So there's absolutely no discussion on the most basic level about cause, effect, implications. Let's take, for example, as we know, Sweden and Finland both joined NATO. Say, do you really want to fight for Finland? I mean, even you would think that the most basic questions would be asked by the media, but they aren't. So therefore, the discussion remains at this ridiculous comic book, or is almost sort of, it's almost a parody of Orwell. Of course we must do it, otherwise tyranny will stalk the world, and Russia will be rolling into the Isle of Wight.
It's funny. It's funny. It's funny you bring that up. For me, 2 points come to mind, and one is how successful they've been in churning out these types of people, these liberal globalists. I mean, again, a lot of the people that I've been around, my peers and even students, some of my students, it seems like most people just care for fame and fortune, for that prestigious post at the UN or whatever international organization, or foreign service, and the prestige that comes with it, and the salary. Students of mine I see photos on LinkedIn with them hanging out with Trudeau, working for U.S. State Department, Mexican Foreign Service. I mean, you name it. And I told them all this stuff. They're in my classes. I taught about the deep state. I Skyped into the classroom people such as yourself, and most of them, by and large, don't care. But and so how they're able to create this system of where you can't question anything, and then you're crazy. And just this morning, there was this news of a Swiss. I mean, this is a perfect example, and apparently she's Bosnian. A Swiss green liberal Muslim politician shooting. No, wait, sorry. Swiss green liberal agnostic Muslim politician shooting an image of Mary and baby Jesus, and then resigning because of that action. I mean, seriously, that combination is really speaks to the liberal globalist perspective. It's very contradictory as well. But I also didn't want to ask you, and what really gets me is what you're talking about is how you can have the I like to call her now Frau Ursula Gertrude von der Leyen's and the Stoltenbergs. It's really a refined fascism, or whatever you want to call it. They've got their suits. They look all nice, and she looks like a nice old grandma. I can't believe, I think she's the mother of 7 kids or something, her bio says. And they speak so well, but like serpents. So they project this image of peace, but it's really diabolical. The wars that they're starting, and the nature of the EU. I want to ask you. For me, it's totalitarian. It's utterly anti-democratic. I believe I've found in my research, notes from some of the founders like Monet, admitting to its anti-democratic nature. It's becoming technocratic. For me to go back home to Croatia next year, I mean, they're now deploying the EES, the entry-exit system, and ETIAS starting this year, next year. So now for my family who are not yet Croatian citizens, I have to fill out this social credit form to ask for approval. Before, when I was growing up, you just buy a ticket and you go to Europe. And now they're creating all of these crazy technocratic systems. I tell this story. My late grandmother, who lived in a village in Croatia, made her own wine and all that stuff. She when she heard the early rumblings in the 2000s, where they said the EU is going to pass a law where even if you make your own homemade alcohol for your own consumption and you don't sell it, they're going to tax you. And she's like, I'm glad I'm going to be dead before that happens. It's just, and she did die in the late 2000s of old age, but it's just obscene what the EU has become. And if you can also comment on what's happening across the board in the UK, grandmas being arrested in their home for thought crime. Past podcast guest CJ Hopkins, American in Germany, who's facing trial for thought crime. Yuri Roshka, former Moldovan politician who's been on the podcast, he's facing years in jail now for thought crime. And so, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, just on I think certainly what I will say, what one of the interesting things that you look in the EU, especially with the new member states, I say new from the post-Cold War expansion, is just how hollowed out those states are. These are weaker states, thinking even Croatia, which is relatively more successful, but, absolutely, kind of industry's gone, and you really, in countries like Bulgaria, now I know these are countries with a different level, who joined the EU at different levels, but you really do see that kind of deindustrialization, kind of erosion of agriculture. So it's definitely quite problematic. I mean, I don't know what you may or may not agree with this, but I know a friend, an old friend and colleague of mine, always makes a joke, who's got connections in both Serbia and Croatia. You know, Croatia won the war and Serbia won the peace. I'm not quite sure that that's true, you know, when you look at what's going on in Serbia. But, you know, there's a real problem, I think, for the new member states in terms of actually remaining viable countries, you know, in terms of people leaving as well. But yeah, so I was also, in terms of the EU, I was also one of the few academics who openly supported Brexit with a few colleagues. So which also was an extremely unpopular position. But that was basically because I agree with you. I think the EU is fundamentally anti-democratic. I mean, the EU was always premised on that, as you say, from the founders. You know, the framing was, it was popular passions that took us to war. And the EU was premised on removing, I mean, explicitly so, more and more areas of policy outside of the public domain. You know, so that's been the kind of fundamental idea, that you shift more and more policies to the community level, where it's decided by intra-elite agreement rather than actually, you know, at the domestic level. I mean, for most of the Cold War, you had what was called the post-war consensus as well within Europe. So there was a level of agreement that certain policies would remain kind of at the national level. And you had, as we know, unions took part, and, you know, what they call corporatism, whereby a certain number of policies, it was agreed that would be agreed on, you know, by organised working class via the unions, etc. And that all goes in the 70s and 80s, and you have the widening and deepening of the EU, and essentially that entails more and more areas of policy being removed from the democratic realm. Yes, so it is a really significant problem, and we even have, for example, people like our friend Ursula, who's extremely unpopular, but she's still received another term because it matters less and less, and that is a real problem for us. And Britain has left the EU, but the lack of democratic accountability, unfortunately, remains. So although we see that kind of leaving the EU, as my friend and colleague says, is unnecessary, but it's not sufficient in order to try and claw back some democratic control. The EU represents a certain way of the way in which post-Cold War political elites have removed policy from us, but even leaving the EU doesn't resolve it. So it's a really difficult one as well.
And I've been saying, you know, even before I started my podcast, that the EU is like the prototype for totalitarian world government. And then I've had guests like Swedish author Jacob Nordengard point this out, and it's even in their own writings. I even found an article, it's somewhere in my feed. People can always go to my X account, or better yet, the Telegram channel, and if you just type in search terms, you'll pull up the articles immediately. But there was one from a few months back which basically said the EU is the model, and it's being exported to the rest of the world. The president of Mexico, López Obrador, outgoing now, in the past couple of years, he's explicitly said we should copy the EU and integrate Canada, USA, and Mexico. El Salvador's president said we should copy the EU and create a Central American Union. South American leaders like ex-Ecuador's president, Rafael Correa, he literally said we should copy the EU in South America. News people might not like to hear, but Putin and technically my former employer, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the former 30-year president of Kazakhstan, They say it was his idea in 1994. The Eurasian Union is in some ways a model or copy of the EU, and so that's been my view. And you're right on ASEAN, of course, in Asia. And in Croatia, it's been completely eviscerated. Everything's been bought up by foreigners. I think we only have one bank remaining that's Croatian owned, and this is the globalization model of the transnational class. Everything is offshored, and so no one owns anything. The people that live in their country, nothing is owned by them. It's all sort of offshored. And I didn't want to ask you about the UK. Because I don't often discuss it on the podcast, but what's happening with Keir, Stalin, Keir Jong-un, Adolf Stammer, some people have been saying, but he's basically trilateral commission backed, or if he's not a member, I think someone else in his cabinet is attended Bilderberg. People talk about World Economic Forum. And so,
we have, the political class in the UK is essentially the same as most of the EU political class. Their happy place is not amongst their voters, but as far away as they can get from the voters. There's a great quote of Keir Starmer before he was president, but when he was head of Labour, being interviewed, I think by Emily Maitlis, one of the big name journalists here, and she said something like, where do you feel, where would you sort of put your faith, or where will you go with? Will it be the voters, or where do you feel most comfortable, or is it Davos? And you can actually find it. It's almost like a spoof. You think, oh come on, someone set this up, and he says Davos. So this, as I was saying, despite having left the EU, the British political class and the vast majority of the British political class did not want to leave the EU. This was definitely this is a whole different discussion. We're happy to discuss an accidental referendum. David Cameron had a bit of a history of asking questions and receiving answers he didn't want to receive, including in 2013, shall we bomb the Syrian government? And Parliament said no. He said, oh, that wasn't the answer I wanted. So the British political class remains a political class that seeks to remove the voters as much as is possible from decisions. Now, New Labour, or they're probably not New Labour anymore, as they used to be called, they are going to embark on a really profound series of constitutional reforms, which you may or may not be, which is probably a whole different discussion, set up by Gordon Brown. And these are it's a continuation of constitutional reforms that occurred in the 90s and noughties when Labour first came to power in 97. And what they are straightforwardly premised on is finding other methods of legitimacy and authority than representation, voting. So that is going to be continued. And there'll be more regional assemblies and citizens' assemblies, and all sorts of, I guess, if you wanted to be cynical, smoke and mirrors stuff, of giving the pretense of consultation in the context in which, for example, the current Labour government received a very small share of the vote. So you're going to see a continuation of a shift away from, a shift away from authority, from our kind of authority, essentially, and different constitutional forms which will give the appearance of greater consultation, but actually will be less democratic. So that's something is kind of in train at the moment, the new constitutional reforms.
You mentioned cynical, and some people call me black pilled. I prefer doom pilled or reality pilled. But I've been just for the past 20 years. I left I decided to expatriate from the American Empire in the 2000s for different reasons. But even back then, I was calling it the United Soviet States of America. But all across the West, we're just seeing like our final destination is Ingsoc and Airstrip 1. I mean, it's literally like George Orwell coming to life. I mean, literally, thought crime is a thing now where you can be fined and jail. Even in Mexico, there have begun cases with Mexican politicians on the trans issue, calling a man dressed up as a woman a man who calls himself a woman. I mean, if you even bring that up, the government has forced one politician to do re-education and stuff like that. And so what are your thoughts on the future of Airstrip 1? I mean, it just feels like we're on this.
Well, welcome. What can I say? Welcome. Our police have been arresting people for tweets or X's, which, as you said, just sounds too weird, for ages, Yes, and that is probably going to increase somewhat under the new Labour government. But this has been, yes, we have been sort of steadily progressing away, the kind of free speech. I guess the area for permitted speech has been shrinking and is not going to come back anytime soon. But for example, I can certainly give Labour a kicking, but we saw during COVID, under the Conservative government in the UK, speech was very much policed. There were units within government that were dedicated to attempting to, smear and stop so-called disinformation, i.e. people who said, well, maybe lockdown's not such a good idea, which of course was treated as disinformation. So this has been a quite significant and I think it has been a shift as well. I do think there has been a narrowing of the kind of arena for speech, because going back a little bit to the media discussion, if you read even the mainstream media in the UK in the 90s, there was a much bigger scope for disagreement. I mean, you had newspapers. I mean, even The Guardian, for example, now post-Snowden kind of turned inside out by the security services. But before that, you had authors and filmmakers like John Pilger, would publish. He would be publishing. So it wasn't huge, but, you would have people like John Pilger making arguments in The Guardian, The Mirror. So you did have a bigger space, a bigger public space, I think. But that has, I think, steadily kind of narrowed. Part of the war on terror, of course, because Britain also has had a whole raft of pretty ferocious legislation as well in terms of surveillance, supposedly anti-terror, terrorism, anti-terror initiatives. So I do think it is becoming more difficult. Yeah. And in fact, just going back to what we were saying about the latest Times hit job on Tim Hayward, it was interesting quotes from Scottish ministers saying, I mean, it was pure. They were literally saying, if you disagree with government policy, it is misinformation. I mean, explicitly, he said, universities must inculcate, is that the right word, or inoculate. Their job is to inoculate everyone against the disinformation. So literally saying, if you disagree, that is disinformation, which of course is the classic way in which misinformation, disinformation has been framed over the last few years. If political disagreements are Kremlin talking points, not.
I mean, that's literally dictatorship. And there was a clip on NATO's X account that I shared just over the weekend where they're promoting their quote cognitive warfare concept.
Yeah.
And in my translation, like, let me translate that for you people. It's like, it's mind control. So they're selling you, them mind controlling you, and you have to sort of like it and accept it. Oh, it's cognitive warfare. No, this is mind control. They want to get you to believe what they believe, and that's not freedom. That's not freedom of thought, critical thinking, freedom of expression. And by the way, shout out to 77th Brigade out there. And myself being a U.S. citizen, I've been subject to the American equivalent. The Department of Homeland Security took me down from PayPal, and you've seen all this stuff now with the Department of Justice going after Russian agents everywhere in America with American podcasters. Yeah. I've been since July. I've been telling my listeners and my paid subscribers on my weekly commentary that there was a spook cutout website that did a write-up on me, calling me a Russian agent for talking to people, to Russian analysts or folks in the multipolar world. I've talked to hawkish American military guests, okay, who are hawkish on China and Russia. Let's be fair here. I talk to everyone, and then we have now what's happening. They raided my former guest Scott Ritter's. The FBI raided his home last month, and now the DOJ has gone after podcasters, calling them Russian agents, and so we are being subject to this information warfare. Last year, they tried to make me out. A similar anonymous spook cutout account tried to link me to neo-Nazi, white supremacist, right-wing fascism, but they failed because I'm a Slavic Mexican. So that's a double plus Untermensch. I'm an Untermensch twice. I'd be exterminated by white national Aryan neo-Nazis. But anyways, I wanted to go on to the war.
But to say, I think that you can see that in, again, and it's quite explicit in British military doctrine, controlling the narrative is the big arena now. Controlling the narrative. And again, of course, you've always had, magazines, newspapers, have had an intense relationship with the secret services, for example, in the UK, and certainly in America. We know that the CIA sponsored magazines during the Cold War and all sorts of things, and art, and but it does, again, I said that nonetheless there did seem to be some space within the public sphere, whether media or even, so I think I probably always say this when I end up talking about stuff, but in the 90s, you had in the British Parliament, you had a minority, but a vocal minority who were against British and American foreign policy, and they were absolutely did not hesitate. I mean, it was so unpopular in 1999 to argue against NATO's intervention in Kosovo, but there were a small number, but significant of Labour MPs who very explicitly said, no, this is wrong. And you just don't have that anymore. So however it's happening, the control of the narrative program is definitely working in terms of shrinking of permissible opinions. And going, if I might, not to jump around, but that the 77th Brigade, which is the famous British Army online info warriors, one of the really interesting things during COVID said was that they were used against domestic what as they were perceived foes. So I think I have said this, where during COVID you sort of saw the foreign policy model coming home much more, being applied to quell domestic arguments instead of very mild kind, like maybe this isn't a good idea.
Yeah, I've when it comes to foreign policy and war, I wanted to ask you that, but first, how a lot of that stuff is coming home, and essentially we've got global elites versus the population. So it's a vertical conflict now. It's no longer nations against nations. I feel like it's the Russian elites versus their own people, the European here in Mexico, and when you talk about information, that links. I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on Great Reset and this basically the neo-feudalism that we're moving into, where they want to erase the middle class. So it's just Klaus Schwab and company, and us poor serfs and plebes, and we're seeing
nothing, but we will be happy. That's the good thing.
Yeah, and the techno tyranny, because this is linked to the information of what we're discussing now, where now they're linking the whole. I like to call it algorithm. For the all these people who are hyped on China and get angry when we say social credit system. Okay, fine. Algorithm ghetto. I've interviewed renowned Jewish historian Edwin Black, and I love that. I interviewed him in 2020, like way back. Like I could see this stuff coming, and he calls it the algorithm ghetto, which is basically the digital gulag. And so what you just said with the 77th Brigade doing the domestic efforts, so then they label you however they want to label you as Edwin Black uses the term, he says your accounts will be zombied, you will become unpersoned, a non-entity. And then now they're bringing in digital IDs and digital currencies, and so this all comes to coalesce. And so if you are not a good little boy or girl, according to as you were saying, 77th Brigade, your government, they can just press a button, well, like what happened to Nigel Farage, love him or hate him, debanked, right?
I mean, I would. The potential digital currency is a profound problem, but we already see that problem. Now, one can think, obviously, as you say, what happened to Nigel Farage, but in Canada, as you'll know, during COVID, when we had the truckers' protests, people would just simply be, again, debunked, shut out of their accounts. So these methods are coming in. I don't know. I just don't know what will happen. I mean, I think in China, the whole social credit system, I think that's somewhat exaggerated. Again, I don't know enough, but I've read enough to say actually the way it's presented in the West, without saying, I think a lot of people who I might agree with in many things and sometimes go in the other way and say, Russia's the answer, China's the answer. But no, as you say, there's just as problematic, and I would actually say, anyway, that's sort of muddling, but just as problematic in terms of the relationship between the citizens, and the political elites. More explicit in China and Russia, of course, whereas in the West, we still maintain a level of democratic activity anyway. I mean, so in Russia as well. So these things are definitely coming in, but so how far they can really be rolled out, I don't know, because there was a lot of discussion during COVID as well about digital passports, vaccine passports, and you can see that they keep trying to bring it up in the EU. But again, how much these things will be rolled out, I don't know. It just sounds but it's just, I just don't know. It's difficult to tell because there's sort of inertia and local problems and local incapacity. I mean, the British state, for example, is not doing very well at the moment in terms of basic capacity to, fill potholes, never mind roll out an entire kind of digital system. So it's difficult to know sort of which way it will go. I mean, one thing is sure, and I have followed the World Economic Forum discussions and so on. And sometimes I do think, I think it's a bit over the top. I think Davos is a forum in which politicians and wealthy people who dislike their own citizens get to meet. So I think it fulfills a function not dissimilar to sort of EU councils and so on, where people can just meet. So yeah, wouldn't it be a good thing if everyone ate beetles and we wouldn't, then we wouldn't have to worry about meat. So I don't know. But what is definitely the case is that our political elites, whether that's Mexico, Croatia, the UK, Russia, want to remove more and more areas of policy from us and present it as, to go back to what you're saying, there is no alternative. That's the beautiful technocratic answer. There is no alternative to this policy on climate. There is no alternative to, I don't know. Yeah.
To eating the bugs. The
mealworms, exactly.
The BBC was at it again. 3 days ago, they published the piece, "Would you eat insects if they were tastier?" And it says 2 billion people, a quarter of the world's population, eat insects as part of their everyday diet, according to the UN. More people should join them. And then they interview chefs saying we have to focus on making them delicious. And some countries have given insect diets a nudge. I've interviewed Patrick Fagan of the UK, who talks about the nudge units and that psychology.
Yes, exactly. Going back to the COVID, yes, the nudge unit was.
And the BBC says insects may well become the superfoods of the future, so they're going to repackage it for us as quinoa and berries. And it says they may be begrudgingly eaten rather than sought out for the joy that a buttery steak or a hearty bowl of ramen brings. But and also on the China point, there was a great podcast by one of my colleagues who's been a guest on the show, Gabriel Custodiet of Watchford Privacy. Shout out, he's probably listening. He interviewed a guy called Roger Huang, who was born in China, but he's Canadian, I think, as well. He wrote a book, Would Mao, I forget the title of the book, Would Mao Buy Bitcoin? Absolutely fascinating discussion. So my view, I agree with you. The social credit thing is hyped up on China, but I think it's still there. That's like a moot point. It's operating in all countries now.
Yeah,
and at different levels. And
I think that would be more, because that's often used as a stick to beat China with, but actually across the world, even in the so-called liberal West. As I say, we can look at what happened with the Canadian truckers during the COVID protests. Nigel Farage again. As obviously many people have heard of Farage. Again, these things are happening more and more in so-called liberal democracy. So that's where we should really be looking at, not fretting. I don't mean that you are, but not worrying about what's going on in China. Because it's our own liberal political elites who are framing everything they do not want us to discuss as misinformation.
Yeah, and that's why I focus most on the West. I'm a Western, American European, and I'm like, why don't you talk about evil Russia, China, whatever? That's for the Russians and Chinese and others. That's not my concern. I'm concerned with my own governments.
That's exactly. I so agree, because I'm often, people often say, apologist, etc. What about Russia? And that's my answer is, but I'm a British citizen. I vote in Britain. My taxes go towards British policy. Of course my interest is in my own state. That just seems to be such a fundamental point, particularly if you are interested in sovereignty and democracy. Your interest is, how does your state act? Because in liberal democracies, at least theoretically, our state acts, with our authority. It really is, our policy. As we've discussed, it's not that straightforward, but so I agree.
And then I guess one of the final themes or talking points, and just to add on that, I don't focus as much on other conflicts. Again, I'm here in Mexico. The news, they kidnapped another mayor, politician, an entire police department in a neighboring state is being investigated and arrested for kidnapping and murdering us Mexican citizens. So it's like look, guys, I've got things to worry about here in Mexico. Other people can focus on other international issues, but the war aspect, this idea of a third world war, you look at foreign policy and security issues and geopolitics, and I view what's going on as, all connected. It's like a multi-front third world war. You've got Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, Iran, China, Taiwan, and the Asia Pacific, the Caucasus, the U.S.-Mexico border, Venezuela, Guyana, this mass flood of migrants into the United States and Europe and the UK. And it just seems like, I just feel like we are on this trajectory towards a third world war, that it's going to happen at some point. And then often these elites historically, they want it. They want it to happen. They're psychopathic. They don't care for their own citizens. I mean, you just look at the Bush administration, the American politicians, the UK, who also were helped get the war in Iraq started for no reason. And I've seen estimates, later on, that millions of innocent Iraqis have died as a result. And so these people think nothing of just tossing millions of people into the fire. And so what are your thoughts when it comes to this sort of
obviously
global geopolitical culture?
I like to hope it's not going to happen. I don't know. I mean, one of the weird things, so you remember, I'm sure you remember, was it Baudrillard wrote that famous article, "The Gulf War did not take place in 2003." Was it sorry, it was in the 90s. He's saying the Gulf War did not take place. And his point was, it's not a war. Everyone said, oh, that's postmodern nonsense. But his point was, it's not a war, because for war you need two sides, whereas this is basically an overwhelming power just wiping out a smaller power, even though, of course, historically Iraq was armed by the US, etc. So, they called it at the time a turkey shoot. And I think that's one of the problems, is that the West in the 90s and noughties and the teens, that's how Western elites, political elites, understand war. You bomb Serbia or Iraq or Libya, send some soldiers into Afghanistan, and Western publics are spectators. The political elites use it for as that's moral authority or whatever. And that's how they've been seeing Ukraine. So the British state is, sending all this military hardware to Ukraine and say, oh, we're going to support you for as long as it takes, billions of pounds, whilst we can't apparently, pay for heating for pensioners, but we have a good media who doesn't like to draw attention to that. Maybe that £4 billion could go there, but that wouldn't be within the remit of the British media to ask that. And we, the public, have been called upon just as spectators. So we had this bigger Homes for Ukrainian Refugees scheme when the war first started, or quite soon after the invasion. And again, that was very much a PR thing. It was about, British people emoting to help Ukrainian refugees. And we know in reality, Johnson was off telling Zelensky not to sign any peace agreements in a couple of months after the war, the invasion started. But so I think some of it is that, because certainly since the end of the Cold War, and even during the Cold War, really post-World War II, Western elites have fought wars over there. And like a few million Arabs died, a few million Vietnamese, okay, whatever. But because it hasn't entailed, it has not entailed the state really, or Western publics. And I think some of it is that, really, not understanding that until now, Western elites have fought wars in which they have dictated the terms. And then when they've got bored, as we know in Libya, we'll just go. Or Iraq or Afghanistan, finally, we left. But now we're fighting a proxy war, and we no longer dictate the terms. And this is the problem. This, I think, is. So I think part of it is that Western elites just are still stuck in this show mode, where they can pontificate and say, oh, tyranny, just, we saw it all with Iraq, Afghanistan, all the sort of same old propaganda nonsense was rolled out, if we don't, we saw it all. So I think that's the question, really. At what point does Russia say, okay, now you have crossed a red line, and sorry, this isn't Serbia, where we just have to suck it up. So I don't know. I think I do think obviously there are many points during the last 2 years in which war could have really kicked off, but haven't. And that is for a reason as well. There have been decisions made, I think. I don't think that's just dumb luck. I think there have been obviously decisions made not to escalate. So I just don't know. No, but I think there is that question of we think our political elites just think everything is Libya or Serbia, just some small state that just has to be pummeled and get on with it. And then when we finish, never mind, do your best. And that's the question.
I'd agree. They think like that, and then if they come up against some Russia or China with nukes, I think it's the mentality of a narcissistic bully, where sometimes they're even, what would be the word, suicidal, in the sense where they'll beat someone lesser, but they'll use nukes and blow themselves up and anyone else. And I think we are in a more dangerous moment than we've been in 20th century history when it comes to Cuban Missile Crisis, or what was it, 1983, the Able Archer.
Yeah, Able Archer.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but I do think it is much more dangerous than certainly, but again, that's the way the Western media presents it, evil Russia. But again, absolutely no discussion about costs, benefits, possible, what might happen. So that's all part and parcel of that way in which is presented. Yeah, so I do think it's very dangerous, but I don't quite know how. I don't know how it will play out. Will there be enough of a break in, European electorates or political elites thinking about what's just happened in Germany in terms of the election? But I think also one of the problem, sorry, not to go back or not to chop and change, but the political elites, because of the way they have been increasingly removing themselves from popular pressure, they've become very removed from consequences as well. So they're just used to, domestically, they're used to slogans. They have no belief that anything's going to happen, even if it's at home. We're going to be, Britain's going to be the best in X, Y, Z, and there will be literally nothing that will happen to make, the policy reality. So I think that's the other thing across the West, in liberal democracies, elites rule via slogans almost. So they're very divorced from consequences. And that is a big problem, again, if you're engaging in a proxy war with a nuclear power, because there could be serious consequences.
I think that's also a very important point. There's no consequences. No one is sacked. You get these Western, in America, you have this dynasty of, this is at the heart of this for me is this total hypocrisy. Well, they'll say Putin's been in power for 20 years. What it's like, or there's this Russian oligarchy. It's like, we have the exact same corrupt oligarchy, if not worse. You've got, since the 90s, it's been the dynasties of Bush, Clinton, Obama, Biden, Trump, Biden, Clinton, Obama. It's just, it doesn't change. And I was talking to some friends over the weekend here in Mexico. When you talk about no consequences, there are these reforms for the judicial system in Mexico. to give less power to the judges. And I have a friend that works in the legal space, and he was telling me, the Mexican judges here get more paid more than the EU apparatchiks. Alone they get $5,000 a month for food alone. They get 6 cell phones.
Yeah.
They get like it's obscene, and there's no consequences.
But look, just even take it. You may. I'm sure you remember Alistair Campbell, the Tony Blair's spin doctor, who was responsible for the 45 minutes. During in 2003. When it was pretty clear that America wanted to go into Iraq to continue the war on terror, Blair and Bush, the Chilcot inquiry revealed all these memos, Blair saying to Bush, that the British people aren't going to buy it. We have to make some kind of link between Saddam and Al-Qaeda and all this stuff. And Alistair Campbell, who was Blair's spin doctor, caused these headlines to be put into British papers, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction that can reach us in 45 minutes. Or he didn't put he had this claim put into a dossier, which was then reported. So actually a key architect behind this terrible conflict, how many millions have died? And I kid you not, he is now on TV as a mental health pundit. So the idea, it is funny. So this is a really good example of someone who, in all justice, should, at the very least, be in prison, at the very least, but that couldn't do, who committed such a terrible act to sort of participate and kick off this dreadful conflict, the consequences of which we still live with. And he's just a mental, he's a regular pundit. He runs a podcast with another MP, and he wrote about his struggles with depression. No kidding. So that is a concrete example of no consequences.
It's a bizarre world, Twilight Zone, where the more psychopathic you are, the more you are
the more damage you did.
Rewarded. Yeah. And so I totally agree with you. One of your main points here is that the Western elites basically are usurping sovereignty. We're on this trajectory, both domestically and internationally. What to do? Any thoughts on, any final thoughts? What can we do? Where do you find hope and whatnot?
I don't really know. I said I did support leaving the EU because for me that was an important step in terms of democratic control. But nothing has changed. So I don't really know anymore. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. If anyone knows, please.
That's a fair answer. I also often I don't know, and people demand solutions from me. Look, I'm just observing what's happening, and I just common sense. What do? You just keep observing, keep speaking out about this.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. Keep speaking out. Hope for the best.
Prepare for the worst. I know people even out in the UK who have bought rural plots of land, and so whether it's a third world war or whether it's the 15-minute cities project, you want to have your rural plot of land so you can still have food and water and not eat the bugs. And I kid you not, openly now in the last few weeks, the Mexican government has been saying we're going to divide Mexico City into multiple 15-minute cities, and other cities in Mexico are now openly unveiling this project. And it's happening in Russia. Sparebank has a 15-minute city project in Russia, and so it's happening all over the place. And so
I definitely think there's a sort of not now, but there is a really interesting discussion to be had about, I guess, what they call in the literature policy transfer, these ideas like 15-minute cities. And because we see very similar things obviously in the UK. about how that happens. It would be an interesting project to look about how those ideas. So, but yeah, it's not like there's any. I think I do. You know, Russia's not going to come to our rescue, people. It's not. This is. Putin is also very happy at Davos. Well, if he were invited anymore, you know, of course, he was initially anointed by the West as well, until NATO went a bit too far and kicked off the kind of. But yeah.
Well, yeah,
so, I don't know. I wish I could say yes. Let's just do this, but I don't know.
That's a good point. I don't think anyone's going to come to our rescue. I don't think Trump's not going to save us. Nigel Farage is not going to save us. And we can hope in the Blade Runners, right? Ules out there in the UK, you got your Blade Runners, so we can hope in those types of people, and we can hope that these elites. I don't know. I don't think it's too wishful thinking to say that they're going to come to their senses, but
yeah, that is too wishful thinking.
We can hope for a Gandalf coming down the hill with his ragtag motley crew.
We'll say it's that, you know, it's interesting. It was, I mean, it depends on what country you're talking about. Say in Germany, I say her name horribly incorrectly. Sarah Wagenknecht's new partner, who used to be with Die Linke, I don't know how you say. You know, she's kind of quite left, anti-NATO. So that's very interesting as a political party, and her party has won a lot of votes. But we don't have anything like that in the UK. I don't know Mexico, but there isn't really. You know, I think so. I think in some, you know, so in Croatia, you know, you still do have a remnant of the kind of old guard. Zoran, is it Milanovic?
Yeah, but you know, I've been following. I've been in contact with a new recent Croatian politician. I'm going to try to get him on. He just dropped out of a coalition, which was supposed to be this sort of dissident right. But I mean, there's just so much grifting, even in a lot of alternative media that's supposedly anti-globalist. I mean, it's hard to get over the narcissism and grifting, and so many of these projects just fail for different reasons. But you mentioned Milanovic, but yeah, I feel Croatia is totally and utterly a vassal of the EU.
Yeah, although I think there's probably a bit more of a sensible discussion about NATO in Croatia. But I don't know. Again, I don't know enough. That's real speculation.
I mean, I also don't know enough. I'm a bit removed, but
you're not yet.
I mean, I've dreamed of retiring at some point away to my grandma's rural village in the middle of nowhere. And, you know, just to hop and a skip away, there are NATO bases. Like, I can't get away, you know, from that. Well, we've covered the waterfront. Tara, any final thoughts? Very much enjoy your work. Your X feed is a great resource. So any final thought, and then where can people find your stuff?
No, thank you very much for asking me on. Yeah, I wish I had a great solution, but I don't. So publish in various places, really. Anyway, the Northern Star, which is sort of run by a few colleagues of mine who have been speaking and working together for a long time. Used to be in Spiked magazine, but they went a little bit. They've become pro-NATO, pro-war. So my pieces aren't welcome anymore. So,
well, keep up the great work. And again, the link is in the description to follow Tara on X. And thanks for being on Geopolitics and Empire. And I guess see you in the next edition of the Times newspaper.
Can't wait for that. Thank you very much for asking me. Lovely to chat to you. Thank you.